be talking to you again. This is Whiteboarding 114, Error Boarding. First, I'm going to add another way not to use a whiteboard. So far we've looked at 3 different ways not to use a whiteboard. That was mechanical boarding, dust boarding, and knowledge boarding. The 4th way to not use whiteboards is called simple response boarding. This is where students write down a very simple response, such as the letter A. We're used to multiple choice with A, B, C, D, so a teacher would flash a multiple choice question up on the screen and say, okay, write down which letter you think it is, A. Usually they'll couple that with mechanical boarding and hold it up. Let me look. Okay, set it down. This way of using whiteboards is really inefficient and ineffective. The element might be something like an entire story. Okay, so we're going to read an entire story, everyone. And then the interaction ends up being multiple choice questions where students simply have to write down the letter or write down a few words. Another example of simple boarding would happen in something like science, where the teacher might say something, perhaps, what is the part of the cell that is the powerhouse? So what do students write down? They write down mitochondria. That's a single word response. It's very simple. Whenever students are writing something simple, we end up violating the philosophy of 3 higher. Remember, with 3 higher, we wanted high visibility, high information, high frequency with immediate feedback and revision. And what we violate here is high information. There's no reason to put down the letter A without telling us why. Give more information. So instead of saying write the letter A, you could change that to have more information by saying, okay, write down the letter A and follow that with because. Then students have to actually explain, this is why I put the letter A. There's no reason to ask for such little information on a whiteboard. It is a space where students can write down their thoughts. Give them interactions that forces them to have to write down a lot of information in their response. So back to the science example, I don't want to just know that you selected mitochondria. I want to make it more complicated, higher rigor with more information. So I'm going to give you a disease, and here are the symptoms of the disease. And you need to tell me which cell part is affected and why. Okay, so then we get a much deeper response, that higher level thinking, mitochondria, because the disease causes a lot of energy reduction, which has to do with the mitochondria. So simple response boards simply lack that information that you need that will give you a chance to walk around, see what students are thinking, and revise. And the way I like to put it is, you have to give students a task that's worthy. A task where it's worth taking the time to walk around and see what every single student's writing. Where it can't just be a guess. I could put down the letter A, but why am I putting the letter A? I might write mitochondria, but you don't know why I wrote mitochondria. And so if we're going to do these cycles, which, are a lot slower in the classroom so we can see all students' thoughts, they have to be responses that are worth taking the time to get immediate feedback and revise. Because if you think about the revision, let's say the response you put was A and the actual answer was C. Okay, everyone, hold up your boards. You see, oh boy, everybody has C except for me, and so what's the revision? I erase C and I write A. There's not a lot of thinking that goes on there, and there's not a lot of learning that happens with that feedback and revision. So you really have to ask for more on a whiteboard in order for responses to be worthy. But this is done in classrooms all the time. I see it a lot in review of multiple choice questions. I just want everyone to be very cautious. Whiteboarding is a we do. It's about learning. And if you don't have enough on that board to facilitate a process of learning, then it's simply a waste of time. Now there's one caveat to this for the younger grades, so kindergarten, first, maybe even a little bit of second. Students are learning to write their thoughts down. And so therefore it's okay for them to do something like draw a shape, or put down a letter, or to simply write a single word. They're working on those writing skills, and it's hard for them to communicate the thoughts up here into a written format. And so what we do instead, because we still want to get students used to sharing their thoughts and getting more information, is we couple that simple response with something like a turn and talk or a time pair share. And so the student writes down, let's say, a circle, and they can't really write because that information's kind of up inside their head. They know why up here, but they can't write it to communicate it. So after they write down the circle, okay, everyone, time pair share. A, share your thoughts. Okay, so A turns, shows their board and says, I put a circle because. All right, then B turns, I put a circle because. And while they're doing that, to increase the information, you as a teacher need to then walk around and listen to the things that are being said. Okay, so that's the younger grades. They're not able to write that information down yet so you can see it. So therefore, you have to facilitate those turn-in talks so that students actually share that information out loud. And eventually, when they get better at writing their thoughts down, that turn-in talk becomes, okay, write it down, now share it. And notice, now the thoughts are on the board, I can walk around, I can see what students have actually put. Okay, onward to our tool for today. So we have gone through our rookie toolbox tools, and we're on our professional toolbox. And today I'm talking about error boarding. Now, error boarding is essentially something that affects all parts of the whiteboard cycle. You can introduce error boarding at any time, and I'm actually going to show how that works today. Error boarding is a simple concept, but it's very powerful. Essentially, you introduce an error. Now, the error can be in the element. So, for example, there's a solved problem that you show students, but there's errors in the solved problem. There's a chunk of text, but there's errors in that chunk of text. The error can be in the interaction. So students have to create an error. So when they're solving a problem or drawing an illustration, they must introduce errors into their illustration. The error can be in the feedback and revision. So for example, I have two boards, one is an error and one is not. So I hold up student responses, and students have to pick which one is the errored response and why, okay, or which one is the correct response and why. So error boards are essentially a way of introducing faulty thinking into whiteboard cycles, so students have to correct it. And there's many different ways that that can happen. And I want to show you a few today. So we'll look at ELA, math, and science today, and how error boards can help facilitate whiteboard cycles. Error boarding is very simple. Students are shown or make an error. That's the first thing that happens. And then the second thing is their response must involve fixing or thinking about that error in some way. So in English language arts, there are many different errors that you can introduce. And it kind of brings me back to that old school mentality of the DOL, right? The daily oral language, where when you came in, there was a sentence on the board and you had to correct that sentence. Well, similar thinking for error boarding with ELA. You could introduce an illustration missing details, or inaccurate or extraneous details, or partial illustration, and students have to fix it or write about what's wrong and what's right about it. You could show a student's illustration and they have to find ways to fix it. A second error board in ELA would be claims that are in error. So students have read a chunk of text and there's a claim that is made and they have to fix that claim on their whiteboard. The claim could possibly be backed up by the wrong evidence. So because of this chunk of text in paragraph 4, we think that this is true because blah, 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 blah. Well, the because statement is completely wrong and students have to fix that. Any writing mistakes like that DOL can be fixed through error boarding. It's a very simple application. There could be an incorrect order of words and students have to correct that order of words. Or you could simply introduce some writing to students that are missing some vital components and pieces. You could introduce something like a poem that's missing alliteration, and students have to fix that poem on their whiteboards. And let me show you how this might work on a whiteboard cycle. Okay, so in this case, students have already read a chunk of text and illustrated it, so they have a good visual memory of that chunk of text. And you're going to give them 5 claims. And each of those claims is going to have an error. The task then is to fix the claim to make them true to the text. This is error boarding because there's errors introduced. It's going to be open boarding. Students are going to mirror the board and probably with just 5 bulleted little dots on their board to know where to write. So I'm also going to use a teacher board here because I want to show students how to do this. And so what I'll do is have them mirror my board, hold up my teacher board, put 5 bullets. So we're going to fix that first error together as they mirror my board so students know what's expected of them. So I'm going to get creative here with my answer response. I'm going to have students in teams of 4 work together. So notice this is not a perfect whiteboard cycle. They're not individually doing this, but let's say we've just read the first chunk of text and I'm not really assessing a lot right now. So my students are going to do consensus boarding, where in a group of 4, their whiteboards must look exactly the same by the end. So in other words, they have to discuss how to fix those errors. And then they have to write down the same thing as their neighbors. Now please notice this is not perfect in that one student could technically do the work while the rest simply copy it down. So this is not going to be my end cycle, because I understand that in some groups there may be more students that do most of the work. But this is, the first time we've done airboarding with this chunk of text, so I'm going to start with that, and then eventually on the next chunk of text they're probably going to do it independently. But also it's great to introduce what I'm going to talk about next week, which is consensus boarding. So the 4 students, they do it together. While that's happening, I'm not going to be looking at their boards because I don't want to see what they're putting anyways, because it might not be their own thinking, right? It's more of a cooperative thing with students. And so I'm going to do a heads up help. So I'm going to walk around the room with my head up, looking for behavior and students working together to try to get more students to contribute their thoughts, to make sure that students are working well together and respectfully in groups. See, that's where that heads up help kind of fits in nicely. I'm going to have students stand up. I'm going to have them get into groups of 2, but with someone not at their own table. You can look at Kagan's cooperative learning to help with how to get students into groups of 2 easily. Student A is going to explain how they fix the error in some of their responses, and student B is going to do the same. And you'd be really organized about that. Okay, student A, you're going to explain the errors in the first 2, and student B, you're going to explain the errors in the second 2 and how you fixed it. So you'll notice that even though students are doing consensus boarding and they could actually borrow information from someone else to complete their boards, they are then going to be accountable for that information when they have to stand up and share it with people. Now the cool thing about that is, okay, I did that in my first cycle. Now students are going to go to another person, right, a totally different person, and they're going to do the same thing, explaining how they fixed the errors. So even if they weren't able to do that the first time, they listened to their peer, they got feedback, and now they go and they pair with someone else, and they're able to explain it the second time. All right, so now it's time for revision. Students sit back down, and I want you to remember that I didn't have my head down at that point because students were borrowing information from other people. So now I'm going to have 5 more errors. So 5 different statements about that chunk of text that students need to fix. And in this case, it's going to be closed boarding. So they're not going to be able to look at what anyone else is writing. They're going to try it again on their own. And while that's happening, I'm now going to walk around with a heads down help, and I'm going to sort of take those mental notes of who can do this and who can't. You'll notice error boarding is in both parts of the equation on this whiteboard cycle. In the interaction was error boarding, and now in the revision there's error boarding as they transfer to a similar element. And that's actually a very powerful way to have students revise, is to give them another element that is very similar. And they have to take their information from what they did before in the early part of the cycle and apply it to the end part of the cycle in more of an independent way. So you notice there's a great cycle of learning that happens here where, okay, we try it the first time with a lot of peer feedback, and then we try it the second time independently, and then the teacher can walk around and see what students are actually able to do. Okay, so let's move on to math. Lots of different ways to introduce errors in math. And I actually find in math classrooms, they don't do a lot of error-based thinking. Students try to solve problems, and errors are bad things. When you're doing error boarding in math, an error can actually be a great thing. Having students introduce errors into their problems as they're solving them, and then having their peers try to fix those errors can be a really powerful process. Because when you're doing it the wrong way, you're actually reinforcing and thinking about what it would look like in the right way. So a couple ways to do error boarding in math. You could give them steps to solve a problem and they're in the wrong order, and students have to fix the order. You could give them a problem that was solved incorrectly, and they have to figure out, well, why was this solved incorrectly? What could you do differently? Or maybe even solve it correctly the second time. You could give them a story problem that's lacking information that they need, and students have to add that information, and then they have to share that and solve the problem. You could violate a mathematical rule in the element, and students have to figure out what rule was violated and why, and how they would fix the problem. You could give them non-examples. Okay, so this is not example of this, fix it to make it an example of this. So lots of different ways to do error boards in math. And let's look at a whiteboard cycle. Okay, so pretty standard. I'm giving them a rigorous applied story problem of some concepts, and their interaction is simply to solve the problem on their board. And you want to be really clear about this. What does it mean to solve problems on whiteboards? Your illustrations and showing all their work and all that. But essentially, they're going to have closed board response with their story problem on their whiteboard. While that's happening, I'm going to do a feedback walk. I'm going to do a selective start. So I'm going to start the story problem Maybe I'm going to draw part of the picture and I'm going to walk around, and if students are struggling to get started, I'm going to kind of flash on the board and say, hey, you can start by doing this. So selective starts are a great way to help students get started. But that's not my only intention as I walk around. I'm also going to be looking for 2 boards where it's being solved correctly. I'm going to look for 2 boards that may have some common errors on them. Those 4 boards I'm actually going to use to help us with our feedback and revision. Okay, so students are done responding, and I've taken those 4 boards away, and I have them. And I'm going to show students that I'm mixing them up, because I don't want them to know whose board is what. We don't want to call someone out for making an error in front of the class. And so I'll erase their names from the boards, and we mixed it up. So they don't know which ones are correct and which ones are not. So now those boards are going to become part of our whiteboard discussion. So now I'm going to do some beyond the board discussion. And in this case, the boards we're going to be talking about are the 4 boards that are up front that students can see. So in groups of 2, student A is going to try to pick one that's correct, and they're going to try to describe how it's correct. And then student B is going to try to pick one that is incorrect, and they're going to describe how it's incorrect. Okay, so there's 4 boards, right? So now they're going to switch. And student A is going to describe one that they think is incorrect and why, and student B is going to describe one that is correct and why. So they're getting peer feedback from each other. So then we need to do our revision, and so here's the revision. Students have to pick one of the boards that they thought was incorrect, and they have to solve that problem again in a correct way to fix the mistakes on that whiteboard. This is going to be closed boarding. I'm going to do a feedback walk where I walk around, and this time it's going to be heads down help. I'm going to look for students that are struggling, and I'm going to get down next to them and try to help them if they need to be helped. All right, on to science. Science is great for error boarding. A lot of different ways we could introduce errors. You could give a scenario where the response to the scenario was an error, so it wasn't correct based on some sort of science principle. You could use a concept incorrectly, and students have to correct how that concept was used. You could have a story problem, once again, without enough information, and students have to add that information based on what they learned in science. You could give them a model with missing or incomplete or errored components that they have to fix. Or you could look for faulty reasoning, and students then have to fix that reasoning. So the whiteboard cycle here is pretty generic, and it can apply to pretty much every science discipline. The element is a science story or scenario. Okay, so here's the story, here's the scenario, there's a science concept that's being applied, but here's the thing, the story is inaccurate. There's something wrong about that story that just doesn't fit what we're learning. And so students have, they got to fix that error on their boards. They're going to rewrite that story or scenario, fixing that information. Okay, while that happens, I'm going to do a heads down help. I'm going to walk around, see where students are struggling, help them out if I need to. And also, I'm going to add some on-the-spot tutors. So if I see a student really struggling, I'm going to have one of my on-the-spot tutors get up and be next to them and offer that sort of one-on-one feedback and help as well. For the feedback and revision, I'm going to introduce an all-star tool for the first time called Whiteboard Groups. So when students are done responding, they're going to stand up and they're going to do what's called blind board passes. So they're going to turn their board over and they're just going to start trading with everybody else until I say stop. Okay, so now they have someone's board that's completely different than their own, and they're going to do what's called a whiteboard group. So on the back of their board, they have some pictures, and one of those pictures is an animal. And around the room are posted animals. So for example, if I have the alligator on the back, then I'm going to go over to the alligator station. Okay, so students are now in random groups of 3 with someone else's board. And their revision is going to be now consensus boarding. So share what that other person wrote down, and your job as a team is to try to fix those responses together, and it is consensus boarding, so at the end you all have to have the same exact response. Because that's a really fun way of randomizing boards, getting students up in completely random teams, and then having them revise someone else's board. All right, so that is error boarding. It's a pretty simple concept, but it can really add some fun variety to students' thinking in whiteboard cycles. So error boarding is great for really upping that rigor, and it gives a different type of interaction and element for students to take a look at. Okay, everyone, I hope you got something from this. I always value your feedback, so feel free to write some responses below. These are concepts I've used throughout the years, but they're constantly in flux, and I'm always learning new things and trying to change things up. So have an excellent week, teachers, and I will talk to you soon.